Hey everyone, I'm here with Dr. Jay. He has earned his Ph.D. in biochemistry from Boston University School of Medicine by researching fats, hormones, and cholesterol. Dr. Jay is currently at the Mayo Clinic in Rochester, Minnesota, researching stem cells, epigenetics, and infrared light. In addition to leading AJCCO, Dr. Jay is a best-selling author of Estrogeneration. Dr. J will also be joining our SelfHacked Science Board, the Science Review Advisory Board for SelfHacked, and so he will be looking over posts that are within his realm of expertise. Anyways, it's been a pleasure to meet you, Dr. J. How are you doing?
Yeah, thanks for having me. Good.
My first question is, how did you get into this field of studying estrogens and how they're harmful for the human body?
Yeah, well, it started back in college when I went to orientation. They had somebody from the city come in and give a talk, and this is in Florida. And they told us to be careful with the drinking water. Make sure you filter your drinking water because it has birth control. This is way back. And I guess they recycle the water. People urinate, birth control. It just ends up in the water supply, and it just condenses. And so that obviously was concerning to me. And I never heard that idea, never even thought of that. And so it was kind of a big epiphany that I should pay attention to what's in my water supply. And then just all throughout my science, education, I paid attention and I learned a lot more. And I ended up doing my PhD on hormones and fats and cholesterol and things like that. And I realized there's not a lot of information out there for lay people to read on this topic. And it's a real issue, a real serious issue.
So you didn't get into this out of any personal experience where you felt ill from these estrogens. It was just something like, you got into this because you thought, hey, this is an important topic and
Correct.
It seems like this can be significant. And
100%.
It's not, we don't really know the full effects of these estrogens in our environment.
Exactly. And the biggest issue from my perspective is the epigenetic issue, meaning you can pass these things on to future generations, these health problems. And because these chemicals are similar to estrogen, they don't usually cause, headaches or bloating or whatever, they don't cause like an immediate noticeable health issue. They usually are more subtle. They're more sneaky and they're more subtle and they're more long-term. And so they do cause a lot of health problems, but it's not so in your face. So people kind of think, oh, it's not that big of a deal because I don't feel bad, when I have these chemicals, whatever, but it ends up catching up to them. That's the big problem.
What are the top diseases or conditions that people can get from being exposed to these estrogenic compounds?
So one of the big ones is infertility. Which of course doesn't happen overnight. It doesn't happen just from these chemicals. It happens from a number of different things, but these chemicals certainly contribute, and in and of themselves, in animal models, they certainly cause infertility. They can lower testosterone. They cause fat, increases in fat, adipocytes. They can cause depression. For example, birth control users have an increased rate of suicide. They've done studies with over 100,000 people. And that's probably the most quantifiable way to look at depression. They cause, the gynecomastia in men, man boobs, basically. And in women, they cause breast cancer. So basically, one of the ways to think about it is if you disrupt the natural hormones, like if a woman gets pregnant, her natural estrogen goes way up. So you get some breast development. If you disrupt that estrogen, you get depression, you get postpartum depression. If you disrupt that estrogen, you get fat, fat gains. Like for example, when women are pregnant, their bodies store more fat, and that's a natural thing. That's a good thing because if they didn't have access to food, which our ancestors may have had those situations, they need that fat. It's the most efficient storage form of energy. So, in a natural setting, that's a good thing, but you disrupt the natural setting with these artificial estrogens, and then you end up with fat, and you can't get rid of it because these things store in your fat. So they signal to your body to hold on to fat, and they store inside your fat. So most of the health issues relate to a natural estrogen process that's disrupted.
So what is the evidence for each of these conditions? You mentioned that when it comes to depression, people who take birth control have higher rates of depression, right?
Correct.
But what about other things like testosterone, weight gain? What is the level of evidence that we're talking about? Is this animal studies? I'm assuming that you're definitely talking about at least animal studies. But
Right.
are we talking about clinical trials or
No.
epidemiological studies? What types of evidence are the most impressive for you within this field that we have?
Yeah, I mean, there's a ton of it. It's overwhelming, and that's the big problem, right? I mean, but it's definitely not clinical trials because they're not going to dose people with this stuff. And the difficulty with human studies in general, even the epidemiology, I'm not super trusting of it because everybody has these chemicals, to different degrees. When they were studying breast cancer, for example, and phthalates, which are chemicals found in plastics, they had a real difficult time finding people that don't have phthalates. Everybody seems to have phthalates. So they had to go to like northern Alaska and find these tribes that don't have phthalates. But then, of course, they're eating a totally different diet. They're living outdoors. Things are so different. I mean, they draw conclusions from those studies, but I don't really trust that, But you start looking at breast cancer, the cells in the dishes, you see the estrogen receptor is activated, and you see the proliferation go up. The cells grow faster. They divide more. They spread more. With phthalates in a dish, and then you move it up to mice, and you certainly see increases in the cancer models for the mice. You certainly see it with the animals, and it's just over and over with all these different chemicals. So for the most part, you're looking at cells in dishes, you're looking at estrogen receptor perturbations, and you're looking at animal studies.
So what about the critique, let's say, that the problem with most of these studies, if I'm looking at animal studies, usually the dosage that they're giving is way higher for any of these chemicals. So what would you answer to that critique?
It's a good question. And the researchers, they specifically use low doses in most of the studies because this is an estrogenic chemical, all these chemicals that I'm looking at, and they still find an effect. In fact, oftentimes they find more of an effect at the low doses. And then at the higher doses, you find less of an effect. You find more toxicity where the cells die, but you find less of an estrogen effect because it's so overwhelming for the cells. They're shutting off their estrogen sensitivity. So it kind of goes back to understanding how hormones work. People inject testosterone and then their receptors. If you keep injecting testosterone, you become desensitized to it because we have negative feedback. And these estrogen chemicals can do the same darn thing. They can actually decrease your receptors. They can lower your response to it. And of course, like you mentioned, and like I already mentioned, that lowers testosterone as well. So it has kind of an interplay between estrogen and testosterone. I mean, there's studies, for example, that and this study you can look at humans that use sunscreen or something, or that use birth control. You can look at, I mean, it's trickier because men obviously don't use birth control, and usually with testosterone, we're talking about men. But they find decreases in total testosterone when you have higher urine levels of phthalates, urine levels of BPA, things like that. So they do those studies, right? They find total testosterone goes down. They find free testosterone goes down. And they find that, for example, these sunscreen chemicals like 4-methylbenzylidene camphor, which is making the news right now, they find those block the testosterone receptor, the androgen receptor. They actually block the receptor. So it's kind of like if you're playing hockey, right? Mm-hmm. And you're trying to score goals, you've got a bunch of people out on the ice, you have high testosterone, and the more people you put on the ice, the more likely you are to score a goal. But if you put a piece of plywood in front of the goal, you block the receptor, you can't score a goal. It doesn't matter if you have super, super high levels of testosterone. If you're blocking the receptor, it's not having an impact. So between those three things, just the testosterone story is a huge problem. When you talk about these chemicals, and the dose doesn't make the poison. There's kind of this common adage you hear in science today that the dose makes the poison, where people like to say, a little bit's not going to hurt you. It's only when you have these toxic doses. It takes a ton of this or that or the other thing to actually kill mice, to kill rats, whatever. So it's not that toxic. The problem with that model is it completely ignores epigenetics. And now we understand epigenetics, and epigenetics marks on top of your DNA. It's like musical notes. You know, if you've got a musical note, like a song, Mary Had a Little Lamb, something like that, just the simple song, that's DNA. You know, you can pass that to somebody else. They play the same song, super simple. Doesn't really change, gets passed over to the next person. But if you play the same song with chords, you know, it's a way more complex song, but it's still the same DNA, the same bass, the same melody is there. But now you've got chords on top of the notes. That's your epigenetics. You can pass those on also, but those you can change a lot easier, and you can disrupt those and mess those up. That's what these artificial estrogens are doing, even at the lowest doses. And that's the most important research, I think. And that's the culmination of my book. That's kind of where I worked up to it. Here's the chemicals, here's the diseases they cause, and here's the long-term impacts. That's kind of what I end the book on, because that's the most significant, impactful thing.
That's really interesting. And so what is, let's say, a health body like the EPA, right?
Right. Mm-hmm.
When they're looking at this stuff, now I don't really trust the Trump EPA. They don't seem to think anything's bad. But
Right.
let's say previous administrations, let's say the Obama administration, they seem to care about, making people healthy. So
Right.
what was the EPA saying about this? What's the plausible deniability in terms of the evidence out there?
Yeah. They just always point to the animal studies with the high doses, like you talk about, where they look for the toxic dose, right? And then it takes a kilogram of this stuff. You have to eat a kilogram every day in order to get the toxicity. And that's kind of the studies that they promote and that they go for. And that's the way the system is set up, right? I mean, the toxicology, the way people are doing toxicology is to just look for that kill curve, and what's the LD50 and all this, and what's the dose that kills 50% of the mice. It's like, it's completely, like I said, it's antiquated because it's not even considering epigenetics. And as soon as you do, you realize there's a long-term ramification that we haven't been considering and that we need to consider. And Europe is considering it because they've made most of these chemicals illegal. In America, part of the problem is you have a lot of influence from these corporations behind the scenes pushing these chemicals. And I mean, they're making a lot of money on them. And so when there's politics and there's money, and those actually have an influence. And the reason I know they have an influence is because there's a woman named Marcia Angel. She's written a few books now, but she used to be the chief editor of the New England Journal of Medicine. And she came out probably about 10 years ago now. And she said, look, I'm stepping down as the chief editor of New England Journal of Medicine because there's so much corporate influence on these studies and the way the studies are done and the way they're skewing the research. And she ethically just stepped down from her position in the New England Journal of Medicine. And she wrote a whole book on the influence of these corporations and these drug companies and the chemical corporations and how they're basically manipulating the politics, including the EPA and the FDA. And it's a bigger problem. So I think people aren't aware of that problem because we assume they're looking out for our best interests. And in many cases, they're getting paid off. But yeah, so it's a mess in that regard. So what I was going to say is you basically have to self-educate yourself. You have to be on top of it with websites like SelfHacked and Estrogeneration, my book, and just basically be thinking for yourself these days and drawing your own conclusions from the research that you're seeing.
I agree with that 100%. I think in addition to the corporate influence and whatnot, I think there's also an ideological divide within the scientific community as well, right?
Oh, yeah.
Are you going to do a linear model, or are we determining effects based on the LD50, like the amount that it takes to kill an animal, based on the toxicity? When I was doing research on radiation, for example, there's a big, question about whether the effects of radiation are harmful only above a threshold, or if there's, if you can make assumptions that even though we can't detect certain levels of harm, we can assume that here's going to be the level below this level of radiation, right?
Right.
I think in addition to the corporate influence is probably also this ideological divide where you believe that lower levels are going to have an impact in people,
right.
And they do impact epigenetics. So my question is, though, what do you know that the other people don't fully appreciate.
Yeah, well, I think people just aren't paying attention. I mean, most of the scientists I know, they love doing their research, but they're in such a niche. They're looking just at one protein, one receptor, one amino acid mutation, one specific niche thing, and they're not really paying attention to their own health, you know? A lot of them, when you talk to them, they couldn't care less about exercise and just the really basic fundamentals of optimizing their own health. So that's the first problem, is they have blinders on and they're looking at such a limited area, and they enjoy their research. Everybody loves what they're doing, but they're not paying attention to optimizing their health. But then when you actually talk to people, like when I sit down and talk to scientists about this, they get it. I mean, I feel like part of it is the story just hasn't been told, you know, the epigenetic aspect. But once you present it as, here's these chemicals, there's a bunch of them, there's at least 10 of them, right? I mean, I made a top 10 list, and the top 10 lists that I focus on are daily exposures, you know, not like Agent Orange, which we're hopefully never exposed to, because that disrupts your estrogen and that disrupts your epigenetics and can have inherited health problems, right? I don't focus on diethylstilbestrol, which used to be an FDA-approved drug that they gave pregnant mothers, and then they realized it causes problems in their offspring. They're 30 years they prescribed that drug, you know, up to about 1970. And obviously I don't focus on that one because we're not exposed every day. But the top 10 list that I made, we are exposed every day. And once you realize every single one of these has specific impacts on your epigenetics, and then they act in an additive way because they're all acting on the estrogen receptor, or they're all acting on these sex hormone systems. So they add on top of each other, right? It's like, well, soy, you know, you can find research kind of going both directions with the soy estrogens. But then if you throw in some atrazine, which is a herbicide that acts like estrogen, and then you throw in some birth control, and then you throw in some of these plastic chemicals like bisphenols, and then you throw the mold estrogen in there, man, you're getting overwhelmed with estrogen, and you're seeing, you know, a lot bigger impact. But not a lot of people are studying multiple exposures. They're just studying one chemical. It's like the radiation. They're just studying radiation, right? Like they're just studying one thing. That's how you get funding, and that's the focus in most science.
Those are two really good points where I definitely agree that a lot of scientists have blinders on. They're trained to study a very specific thing, and it also attracts people who have goggles on, right? The people who don't mind studying very specific and narrow topics, those are the people who go into, you know, who get their PhDs often, and they have very narrow points of view, whereas, you know, some people have more, they like to see the big picture kind of thing. So that was a really good point about, you know, scientists and how they're looking at a very small part of the picture.
Yeah, 100%. And just to add to what we were saying before about corporate influence, you know, a lot of times there's money behind the scenes funding some of these researchers to look at one specific thing, you know, and then they publish that specific study, even though there's other studies out there that kind of go in a different direction. And that throws everybody off. It confuses everybody when there's, you know, a study that's positive for soy, for example, showing, oh, soy estrogen is actually beneficial for this, that, and the other thing. And then there's 10 studies that show soy estrogen is problematic for 10 things. You know, all it takes is one or two studies that are done in such a way that you find a specific result. So you can do these things, you can manipulate things in science that ends up actually ultimately manipulating the EPA or the FDA that starts at the basic science level, you know. So that's another problem, I think, that within the technical field that most lay people, they're not realizing. There's a lot of wiggle room in these studies. You can kind of focus on one aspect. You can focus on the toxicity, you know, because you know that these cells aren't going to die, and then tout that as that's like a really good thing, even though another study might show, yeah, but it causes increases in weight gain, fat gains, right? Like they did a study with atrazine in mice. I can't remember the title of the study, but it's something about insulin resistance and mitochondrial dysfunction with atrazine in rats or mice. They gave them the exact same diet, exact same calories, everything exactly the same, big group, two different groups of mice. The only difference was low dose atrazine in the drinking water of one group, and that group got fat. And then they pinned it down to mitochondrial dysfunction. But again, atrazine is still legal in America. Why? Because there's other studies that show it doesn't kill their cells. It doesn't kill the mice, takes crazy high doses to kill things. So it's a strange situation.
So can you tell us a bit about what exactly these estrogens are doing to epigenetics?
Yeah, for sure. So normally your sex hormones, they can actually go through your cell membranes. So, for people that don't realize, cells have a lipid bilayer, and then they also have a nuclear membrane. They have DNA inside the cell, but it's not just inside the cell, it's inside another membrane. So it's kind of like a pillowcase, and then you go inside the cell, and then there's another pillowcase to protect the DNA. So DNA is really protected. So when things go into a cell, most of the time that's as far as they go. They don't actually go into the DNA. But with sex hormones like estrogen, testosterone, they actually go into the nuclear membrane. They can go through both membranes. And that's really important because, if you bastardize that system with artificial estrogens, with these estrogen chemicals, you're in the proximity of the DNA. And sure enough, you start doing DMRs, differential methylation, methylated regions. You start looking at the epigenetic marks on the DNA, and you start seeing big shifts in the presence of these estrogen chemicals. The real researcher who's unbelievable in this regard is Michael Skinner. He's out in Washington, I think. I've had lunch with him here at the Mayo Clinic and talked to him for a couple hours. And he grows between 3,000 and 5,000 mice at any given time. And that's what he studies. He studies methylation on DNA. And you throw these estrogen chemicals in and you see massive methylation pattern changes. You see the marks change. So there's no question they are changing. Exactly how they're changing, it's up for debate. A lot of people contest that. But to be honest, who cares? It's definitely doing the change. My guess is that it's because they're going in through the nuclear membrane, but that's not super well established. But again, it doesn't need to be well established because we're definitely changing the marks.
Right. I mean, in some way, after we eat a meal, we're probably changing the marks as well.
Exactly. Right.
But I think the point you're trying to make is that it's causing a change. It's not just not doing anything to your epigenetics. It's possible theoretically that even some of the changes are positive.
Exactly.
But probably not.
Well, and that's what I was going to say. If you're exercising and eating healthy and B vitamins and choline and curcumin, and there's certain supplements that absolutely change your epigenetics in a positive way. And then there's other ones that change it in a negative way. And how do you know for sure whether it's positive or negative? Well, you start looking at the next generations. And that's what Michael Skinner, like, for example, he's found that the mice, when you have these chemicals, especially the phthalates and the BPAs he studies, when you start looking at these plastic chemicals, and again, this is nanogram levels, like 1,000 nanograms. That's the same kind of levels we're talking about in bottled water, 1,000 nanograms per liter. And men's natural estrogen is about 20 nanograms per liter. And then we're ingesting these thousands of nanograms per liter of phthalates or BPA or BPS or whichever bisphenol. And the impact you see is decreased fertility in the next generation, decreased fertility even further in the next generation. 4 generations out, you see the impact. 4 generations. So it's not just the exposure to the gametes, because you could say, well, the mother's exposed, so that's 1 generation, and then the fetus inside is exposed, that's 2 generations, and then the fetus has stem cells for the gonads or the reproductive organs, so that's 3 generations being exposed all at once. But you can't make that argument for the 4th generation. But you see the impacts in the 4th generation. So wow. And you don't see that if you change your diet, right? I mean, those types of changes that are multi-generational, that takes a heck of a whack. It's hard to make that substantial of a change.
Yeah. So take us through some of the big sources of these chemicals. All right. So we know there's plastic bottles, and you even argue, even if it's BPA-free, they'll have analogs like BPS, and then there'll be phthalates. So the plastics, all the plastics, you would say are not good. Is that correct?
Correct. I mean, within reason, right? I mean, when I'm traveling, I certainly go and grab a plastic bottle if I have to. It's better than drinking out of the sink. But it's the daily exposure, right? I mean, let your body clear that stuff once in a while, not a big deal. When you're doing the daily exposure thing, or if you have a susceptibility to breast cancer or depression, right? Or you're pregnant, well, then maybe be super strict. And in my book, that's kind of how I approach it. It's like I have a gold plan, a silver plan, and a bronze plan, depending on your budget and whether you're a pro athlete or a college student on a budget or whatever. So you have to kind of think about your own life and your own context in this regard. But for sure, I think people need to avoid plastics and get stainless steel or glass, or ceramic.
What about, let's say, those hard plastics that you get in 5-gallon jugs, right? So some people, basically, if you have a water cooler and you get your water delivered, almost always they're plastic, but they're
Right.
that hard plastic. They're not the soft plastic that you get
Right.
with a,
Yeah, usually that's
polyethylene.
plastic. Yeah, usually that's plastic number 1, which is polyethylene terephthalate, which is leaching phthalates.
Okay.
They used to say plastic number 7. If you look on the recycling symbol and it has a 1, like a number 1, that's polyethylene terephthalate. And some scientists tell you that that doesn't leach. They'll be like, oh, it doesn't leach because the phthalate's covalently bound onto there. It's polyethylene, but phthalate is covalently linked. The problem is they used to say the same thing about BPA. They said, oh, bisphenol A doesn't leach because it's all linked together in a chain and this and that. But you always end up with free bisphenol A molecules. You always end up with a few of the free, and the same with the phthalates. You always end up with free phthalates, and then it ends up in there. But plastic number 2, 4, and 5, if you have to go with plastic, 2, 4, and 5 are the best in terms of not having phthalates. So if you find plastic and you look on the recycling symbol and it's a 2, 4, and 5, it's better than the other ones, but still better to avoid it. Better to filter your own water, in my mind, especially using activated charcoal, because activated charcoal removes estrogenics. But again, in a pinch.
And you'll save the oceans while you're at it.
100%. Yeah, that's becoming a bigger issue, huh?
Yeah. So where else do people get these chemicals? You mentioned sunscreens. Are all sunscreens pretty much on the market bad?
Pretty much, if you go to the store and you just grab a sunscreen. But now they have a lot more options. You can find zinc sunscreens that don't have oxybenzone or benzophenone or 4-methylbenzylene camphor. So you can definitely use sunscreen. You just have to find stuff without those goofy chemicals in them. And like I say, if you've got 20% zinc and you can pronounce all the other ingredients, you're probably good. But yeah.
Do you have a special sunscreen that you have, like a natural one, or you just cover your skin?
Have you ever used melanotan? Melanotan.
I have, yeah.
Yeah, there's a peptide called melanotan 2. There's melanotan 1 and melanotan 2. Melanotan 2 really makes people tan for the most part. If people want to go really extreme and they're biohacking. But yeah, no, they actually make spray zinc sunscreens that you can spray, because some public schools require spray sunscreen for certain field trips and things for kids. So now they have all kinds of options,
What do you personally do?
So I have a whole web page on my AJ Consulting Company website. It's called What I Use. It's like ajconsultingcompany.com/what I use. And it literally just tells people, here's what I use. Because I get emails literally every day before that. They say, well, what sunscreen do you use? What soap do you use? And it's not exhaustive at all. It doesn't say, here's every soap that's on the market that's good. It's just, hey, this is the one I use. It's affordable. It doesn't have any crap in it. And I use it. And I don't have any endorsements from any of the companies or anything like that. So it's not like a biased, product endorsement. I specifically stay away from that so that I'm not biased.
Are the soaps, let's say hand soaps or shampoos, conditioners, they also have these chemicals and they can leach in?
Yeah, exactly.
So unless they're pretty natural, as in like most of the chemicals are, you can understand them, and they're probably by some natural brand. You're saying that the ones that are produced by Procter and Gamble,
right,
they're all going to have these kinds of estrogenic compounds, and they will go through your skin.
Yeah, just like testosterone patches or something like that, right? I mean, that's why the news right now is so ironic. Is it's making news, making headlines that sunscreen goes through your skin. It was previously unknown. It's like we've been using this stuff for 20 years, and they never did a study on whether or not it actually goes through your skin. And now they finally did, and they realized, oops, all this research that shows all these problems with all these chemicals, now it's way more relevant because it actually goes in your skin. But if you just look at the molecular structure, you'd realize, of course, it's going to go through your skin. And the phthalates do the same thing, right? And they put phthalates, they put parabens, they put oxybenzone, benzophenones. Oftentimes they put those benzophenones, those sunscreen chemicals, in the shampoos to protect your hair against UV damage, against sun damage. So that's the justification. Oftentimes they don't put any of those on the ingredient list. They sneak them in under the term fragrance. So they use this term fragrance or perfume.
Natural fragrance.
Yeah. And they're allowed to kind of sneak a lot of these chemicals in there. because it's quote unquote proprietary. It's like their secret formula they don't want to reveal. But in reality, it's just their way of cheapening out the product. And technically, phthalates do make perfume travel farther through the air. That's how they justify it. If you talk to these chemical company or these chemists, these professional chemists for these chemical companies, they say, well, we put it in there because it makes the fragrance travel farther.
So you're saying like cologne or perfume, those are
That's a
definitely going to have these estrogenic compounds.
Yeah, they've done studies on pregnant mothers because they were concerned. And I think it was even published in Nature a while back. They published a study. Women that use perfumes while they're pregnant have 167% higher phthalates in their urine.
Oh, wow.
And in their blood. And they tested both. I can't remember the number for blood, but it was way high. And it's like, you definitely don't want to be using perfumes unless you absolutely know this stuff is natural, and you want to look for like phthalate free, paraben free. It's got to have this long list of like everything free.
Unlikely you'll get one that smells good and it'll be free of everything though.
Yeah, that's the hard part.
What is the top 3 in terms of, if you use this, then the most is going to get into your system? So for example, are we talking about bottled water? Since you're drinking so much of it, if it's from plastic, a lot of it's going to leach. That is where you're getting the most plastics. Or would we be talking about sunscreen? If you're putting it all over your body and, it's on there for many hours, maybe that's where you're getting the most, right? So what is the top 3 sources of these non-natural estrogenic compounds?
Right. Well, I agree. I think it's water. That's number 1. I think the number 2, 3, 4, 5, they're all personal care product related. I think you clean up your personal care products and you clean up your water, you're going to be doing yourself a huge long-term favor and your future generations a long-term favor. I mean, those are definitely the big wins. I mean,
personal
grains,
care as in shampoo, conditioners, soaps, perfumes or colognes, stuff like that.
Exactly. And deodorant. Yeah. And a lot of people think, well, but I'm washing it off, right? But the problem is these substances prefer to stay on your skin. They prefer to cling on your skin. Mm-hmm. And even the darn laundry detergent. When we go to our in-laws, sometimes we do our laundry there, and they just use a conventional laundry detergent, which smells really strong. Mm-hmm. It's just Tide or whatever it is. And here at my house, I use this stuff called it's 7th Generation is the brand, and it's fragrance free and all this. Not that I'm against fragrances, but it's better just to be safe. And right. And it's amazing. It takes, when we come back from our in-laws, our clothes smell so strongly of that detergent smell, and it takes 3 or 4 washes to get it off. I mean, it takes weeks to get that smell out. It's unbelievable how much it stays on, and it does the same on your skin. You just don't realize it as much, because your skin takes it up and then it goes in your blood. It bioaccumulates, because that's the other aspect, right? Which we didn't talk about before when we were talking about toxicity. Toxicity studies don't think about bioaccumulation. They're done over the course of like 3 weeks or at most, usually just 1 week or something like that. And they're not even factoring in, oh yeah, these things store in your body. So if you take a little bit of a dose and then the next week you have a little dose, and the next week or the next day and the next day and the next day, you just keep building up more and more. And that's obviously going to have more of an impact than just a single dose, which is what's being studied.
So where are these getting stored? I assume in the fat tissues?
Right, correct, yeah. And that's why saunas are so awesome, right? I mean, that's one of the reasons. Saunas increase heat shock proteins and this and that, and all kinds of cool benefits, but they also decrease estrogens. They've done skin patch studies where they have basically nicotine patches on people, except without the nicotine, just an empty patch. And then they have them going, groups of people with and without sauna treatment. And the people that go in the saunas, they come out and they test for chemicals on those patches, and they're full of BPA, they're full of phthalates, they're full of all these estrogen chemicals. And so what you're doing is you're actually sweating them out. You're speeding up molecular motion. You're allowing these chemicals to get out of the fat cells, get into your blood, get into your sweat glands, get out,
Interesting. So the sauna actually does that. You hear a lot like, oh, saunas are going to detox.
Right.
You think, well, yeah, it's probably through like, some biochemical pathway, and maybe it does, it does excrete some stuff while you sweat, but what does it actually excrete? We don't know exactly. But you're saying that it actually excretes these estrogenic compounds.
Yep, absolutely. they call them the bus studies, BUS, blood, urine, and sweat. They test all three, and they show all three of them are increased when you sit in the sauna.
Oh,
Excretion.
wow.
Yep.
So that would be one of your best hacks to getting rid of these estrogenic compounds.
100%.
Detox.
Yeah. Yep. You start with avoiding them, and then you start with hitting the sauna just to expedite the process of elimination. That's my strategy. Yep.
How long could it take to get rid of, like, basically if you stop drinking the waters, if you got away from the personal care products, how long would it take you to detox from?
Well, it's hard to. Super good question. It's just difficult to say because of the epigenetics, right? If you messed up your epigenetics, it's kind of like scratching a CD, and it's like, well, what does it take to unscratch that CD? I don't know the answer to that. But in terms of eliminating them directly from the fat cells, we know how long the average fat cell lives, 1.5 years. And they've found from radioactivity studies with people that were exposed to the atomic bomb and things like that, they've found fat cells can live up to 10 years, but the average one is 1.5 years. So I would say it can take a good year, but that's why you want to use the sauna so much, because if you're hitting the sauna, you're going to expedite that. You're going to go way faster than a year. It might take a good 6 months though to really get them out.
Interesting.
Mm-hmm.
So what are the top 5 most harmful chemicals that you think we need to stay away from? Would you say that one of them is BPA or not even?
Probably. Yeah, if you're going to make me do top 5. I mean, there's one that's we haven't even talked about, and it's mycoestrogen. So mold estrogen, right? One of the reasons mold is so darn toxic is because mold secretes a chemical called zearalenone. It's spelled ZEA, zearalenone, oftentimes just abbreviated ZEA. And that acts like estrogen in your body. It disrupts estrogen. If you feed pigs moldy grains, they go into estrus super early. They have all these reproductive issues with their cycles. I mean, shoot, girls are going into puberty far younger ages than they used to, and it's because of these estrogen chemicals. And then what they're trying to do in the science journals right now is they're trying to redefine the normal age range of puberty, because so many 8-year-old girls and things are going into puberty, and this used to be such an anomaly, but now it's so common. They're actually saying, well, we don't know why this is happening, but let's redefine the normal range, which they've already done with testosterone, because testosterone has dropped so much. They've redefined the normal range for testosterone, and they've dropped it, so that if you come in with a 250 total testosterone, they consider that normal now. And like 10 years ago, they didn't consider that normal at all. But that's just because the average population has dropped so much. So
have you tested your testosterone before and after, like you started staying away from these things?
No, but a few people have. A guy over in the UK I did a podcast with him, and then he said, okay, I'll do a 10-week or a 6-week or something. And his went up. I can't remember the number for his. There was another guy who did a blog, and he tested this. He avoided all the chemicals that I said, and his went up like 160 something percent, if I remember right, 154%. I can't remember the exact number, but it was a massive. Yeah, I mean, people that do the experiment, it's always a tricky experiment because, time of year might matter. Like there's so many factors you can argue that the study's not that good, but I've never seen somebody get rid of these chemicals and have their testosterone go down.
Right. What
certainly helps.
So what are the top mechanisms, the reasons why these estrogenic chemicals are bad? Is that because they compete with testosterone? Is that because they block the testosterone receptor? They're blocking one of the estrogen receptors, or they're activating it but not enough? Right. What's exactly happening? Or they're activating the estrogen receptors too much?
Well, all of the above, and it's not really clear. It's super difficult to delineate all of that because, just take phthalates, right? Or parabens. There's methylparaben, there's propylparaben, there's butylparaben. So it's like, well, which paraben are you talking about, right? And then when your body sees some of these chemicals, they start breaking them down, and then you have these byproducts, which are complex molecules. And then there's 10 of those, right? For methylparaben, there'll be 10, and for propyl. And then it's like nobody's doing those studies where they're actually trying to figure out all the different complications. But, just looking at estrogen receptor activation, usually you do see activation of the estrogen receptor. So that's a good place to start. Like for example, they actually found that lavender was causing gynecomastia. This is one of the chemicals, one of the natural ones I talk about. I talk about soy and lavender in my book as well, aside
And
from all
also
these
flax.
artificial and flax, correct.
Okay.
Yep, and also marijuana. So those are the four. Marijuana smoke. So the edibles don't have any estrogenic effect, but the smoke can have estrogenic effect and cause, some estrogenic issues. And it's also linked to infertility in teens. So that's why when you're a teenager, you got to be really careful with the smoke. But lavender, they had a bunch of kids that had man boobs. They were little boys and they had man boobs, and then they removed all the lavender from their personal care products, and the man boobs went away. And
Oh wow.
this was published in the New England Journal of Medicine, and since it's been followed up in a couple other studies, it was lavender essential oil, and they've used different brands of essential oil. People oftentimes they hate on me for this. It's like, well, I'm just telling you what there's some studies, but it's not just one brand of essential oil or something like that. But the most convincing part of that New England Journal of Medicine research was they looked at the estrogen receptor activation in cells, and they find that lavender essential oil activated the estrogen receptor. Right? So they're doing these luciferase assays. They're kind of technical. Basically, you're looking at, you're adding essential oil, and then you're seeing if the receptor is being activated enough to increase gene expression. Does that make sense?
Yeah. So I mean, so you're mentioning that a lot of the harmful effects are just by simply overactivating the estrogen
Correct.
receptors, right?
Exactly.
And there's the alpha and beta receptor. My question is, I mean, so there's a lot of benefits to estrogen as well, right?
Correct. Yeah, 100%.
It improves
In fact,
memory. It does a lot of it can improve various types of cognitive function. It can be anti-inflammatory. There's a lot of benefits to estrogen. So the question is, at which point, let's say you mentioned 20 nanograms per deciliter or something is the average. So let's just talk about the blood of a man. If a man has a number 40, right?
Mm-hmm.
What does that mean to that man? Does that mean that's unhealthy?
No, because the ratio is what really matters. So if you've got a good ratio between testosterone and estrogen, it's kind of like omega-3 versus omega-6, like basically if your testosterone is really high, you actually expect to see estrogen up around 80, if your testosterone is really, if your testosterone is up around 1,000. But if your testosterone is at 200 and then your estrogen is up around 80, that's way too high. So the problem with a lot of these blood tests is they're not factoring in the ratio, and they're just saying, oh, your estrogen is 80, that must be terrible. But that's because most Americans are really low in testosterone, so that is terrible, right? But if you come in at really high testosterone and you've got really high estrogen, that's actually really protective for your arteries and for your brain function, like you said, and all these other things, and your prostate, and a lot of it is because it activates the beta receptor. The estrogen receptor beta is usually, more of a target for health benefits. So like it's more protective against breast cancer. It's more protective for your prostate. So a lot of these plant estrogens that are beneficial, they're actually activating the beta receptor way more than the alpha receptor. I know that's getting into the weeds a little bit.
But the main thing is that there's two types of estrogen receptors that the estrogen is activating, and one type is better than the other, essentially.
Exactly. Yep. And what's funny about it, there's a vegan named Michael Greger. You probably have heard of him. He talks about how great soy is, because it seems like vegans, they love soy because everything they're eating is made from soy, more or less, it seems. It's exaggeration, but you know what I mean? But he has a whole video on estrogen receptor alpha and beta and how soy activates the beta receptor specifically. Oh, and what's funny is, first of all, the paper that he cited, it had two figures, right? It had two different cell types. They tested soy against one type of cell, human cells, and they found it activated the estrogen receptor alpha way more than beta. But then they tested it again in a different cell type, and they found that it activated beta way more than alpha. Depending on the type of cell, it has totally different effects. So some people are more disposed to health problems from soy than other people, depending on which organ that they have that might be more susceptible. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
I mean, it gets kind of complicated pretty fast with soy because, there's different activation in different cell types. Like your kidneys are going to respond different than your liver, which may, if you've got a risk for blood clotting issues, right? It's going to be a different scenario than if you've got a risk for breast cancer, and that's a different scenario than if you've got a risk for thyroid problems, and that's a different scenario than if you've got a huge risk for prostate. So in all those contexts, you can't really generalize a lot of this, but in general, I do kind of generalize anyway. And I just tell people avoid soy for the most part. It's better just to avoid it. If you want
What about flax? Avoid that
flax
as well?
the same. I think so. The reason there's so many benefits from flax is there are good omega-3s, and there's actually CBD in flax. And so there's benefits to flax that kind of outweigh some of the potential issues. But, they did a study with over 100 plant foods. It was a Canadian study, just purely looking at how much estrogen, plant estrogen, they call it phytoestrogen. And every plant they tested was under 1,000 micrograms of the phytoestrogen, except soy and flax. Soy and flax were over 100,000 micrograms. I mean, they're just like far exceeding, any of the other foods. Like, for example, chickpeas had 9 micrograms, right? And soy was over 100,000. It's not even in the same ballpark. So the discussion is totally different, flax and soy, in my mind. And so, again, best to avoid those. And if you really want to activate your estrogen receptor, increase your testosterone, number one. So you aromatize, and then you have a natural, nice balance between estrogen and testosterone. And then number two, you can take something like Epigenin, or some other supplement that selectively activates your beta receptor, and there's not a bunch of debate about it. It's real clear that it activates your beta and not your alpha estrogen receptor. Like for postmenopause, it's the same thing.
Yeah, but the question is, how bioavailable is Epigenin?
Right. It's a good question. I mean, but almost all plant compounds are pretty low bioavailability, and it doesn't take that much to have an impact. But that's but at least the stuff that's getting into your system there's no debate about whether it's activating beta or alpha. It's activating beta, which is the good receptor. You know what I mean? Whereas soy, there is a lot of debate, and there's a lot of confusion, and there's a lot of corporate influence, which makes it even further confusing.
Right. Interesting. So you think that soy is definitely related to breast cancer? Because I know that's there's studies that show it is and studies that show it's not.
Right. I mean, I do, but with a lot of caveats and a lot of nuance. It's hard, right? It's hard to know when you're trying to cut through corporate influence. It's tricky, and it depends on genetics too. That's another big thing, because, for example, people with the gene issue, there's a gene called CYP1B1, and it's involved in breaking down xenoestrogens. And I was just doing a DNA consult today with somebody just before we got on here, and he had the CYP1B1 gene issue. And inevitably, people with that gene issue, they struggle with estrogen symptoms, like real bad estrogen symptoms. And for men, it's gynecomastia. So for that guy, right, for somebody with a CYP1B1 gene issue or some other similar kind of gene issue, I'd be way more careful with soy. And so the genetics do matter there.
Interesting.
And that's similar even for postmenopause women, or for people that have a prostate cancer risk, And licorice root, by the way, is another good one. That's a beta receptor activator instead of alpha. Red clover is similar. It activates a beta and not alpha, although it's a little bit less. Equal is another one. I don't know if you've heard of Equal.
Equal. How do you spell it?
Yeah, EQUOL. It's actually a breakdown product of the soy estrogen. So that's one of the reasons it's so confusing with soy, is because when it gets broken down, some of it is a beta activator and some is an alpha activator. But if you just take the Equal, just that one breakdown product, and isolate that, that's pretty specific to beta.
What's your diet like overall?
I cycle it. I do intermittent fasting. I always have my whole life, because I've been gluten sensitive my whole life, but I didn't realize it until halfway through my Ph.D. So when I was a kid, of course, all my parents ever had was cereals and things, and it hurts my stomach, so I wouldn't eat anything for breakfast. I would start eating at about noon. So now, I mean, I've always done that. I hate breakfast. It's just like ingrained in me now at this point. It doesn't bother me in the least. And what I do now is I do low carb for lunch, basically kind of keto type diet for lunch. And then for dinner, I pretty much just eat whatever. And by whatever, I mean healthy foods, but
But carbs, whatever, fats.
For sure. But then once every 6 months or so,
Except soy.
Yeah, no soy. I don't need grains, especially wheat, like wheats and things like that. But usually not
You don't eat
grains.
grains even at night?
No, not even. I sometimes do, but most of the time, no. I definitely get a stomach ache and acid reflux and stuff from most of them. Rice I'll eat for sure. I mean, I'm generalizing if I say grains, but yeah, I do really well. That's the optimal. And then every 6 months or so, I'll actually do keto for about a month, just because it really motivates me to write more and work harder. For some reason, when I'm in keto, I'm like super, super productive. So much so I don't even sleep. I sleep like 3 hours a night, and I've always struggled with sleep. So that's why I don't do keto all the time. I just can't recover in terms of my sleep. I'm worried about it. I don't feel bad, but I'm worried in terms of, my immune system and long-term health and all that.
What's your issue with sleep? Is that latency, like the time it takes to go to sleep, or?
Yeah, I think I had crappy childhood hygiene with sleep. My dad's a medical doctor too. He went to the Mayo Medical School actually, and he would stay up till like 4 a.m. a lot of the times, and he'd be shuffling around with his flashlight on or having the lights on, and then I'd be up. And I think I just had a really poor situation as a child, and that's really stuck with my epigenetics. That's just my own hypothesis.
I would respectfully disagree with that hypothesis just from personal experience.
So you had crappy sleep
terrible
hygiene?
Oh, terrible. I would go to sleep at like 4 a.m, wake up, go to school late every day. This is from when I was a young kid. So the worst sleep hygiene you can imagine. I had issues with sleep until 25, 26. I had it for a long time. But then I changed a couple things, and then the whole thing just it normalized. It's unbelievable. I used to be like a night owl, and now I naturally want to go to sleep at around 9:00 p.m.
Right. No, I do good now too. I have to really be specific about it. I have to stop eating at like 6 p.m. and I have to get up every day at the exact same time, and then it normalizes real nice, and I get really tired when I'm supposed to and everything.
Do you block out light in the evening?
Oh, big time. Big time.
Okay, so you do that. Yeah, as you block out light, you probably find you get more sleepy.
Oh yeah.
Earlier.
My bedroom is like the pitchiest of pitch black.
Right.
And I've got one of those noise making machines, those fan machines. I mean, the problem is, like, I've got kids and they wake up sometimes, so it's tricky.
Oh, okay,
I have 4 kids, so
yeah, that's harder. I think also for me a big thing was diet. Like, as long as I was getting some inflammation from my diet, any kind of grain really just it gave me inflammation, and the inflammation it completely disrupted my circadian rhythm.
Yeah, I'm sure that's
it made me a night owl. Whereas when the inflammation just went away, I was an early bird.
That's awesome.
So tell me about analyzing people's genetics. What are your top genes that you look for? As you know, we have selfdecode.com.
Right.
So
I love it.
that's a platform that allows people to look at a whole bunch of different genes, and also has reports that you can download on different topics.
Yeah, you guys do the best of any I've seen. I've paid for a million of these. I've bought yours. I've paid for yours separately before we even met, a long time ago. And I've gotten Rhonda Patrick's. I've done everybody's. I'm not kidding. I really think you guys have the best one out there. I look at a ton of different genes, and I have kind of an ongoing file of different things. So what I do is I categorize. I'd make 5 categories. One of them is detox. One of them is diet. One of them is brain. One of them is training, like exercise, and then one of them is sleep. So those are kind of the categories that I've always broken it down into. And basically for me, it's more about just talking to people and finding out where they're at, what their sex is, what their age, what's their past medical history, just really trying to work with people and figure out, how their genetics can, interact with their lifestyle and how we can optimize that for whatever their goals are. So some people want longevity, some people just want performance, and they're like, to hell with longevity. Different people have different goals. So a lot of my focus is to try and put that all into perspective and then focus on whatever they want to focus on. So if they really are worried about plaques in their arteries, then I'll look at whatever gene panel is related to that. For example, like one of the people I had today, same guy with the estrogen man boobs gene, CYP1B1 I mentioned before. He's tinkering with the carnivore diet right now, But the problem is he's got a gene called CDKN2A or N2B, CDKN2B. And that gene, it's involved in basically higher risk for heart attack because of plaques in your arteries. And it's relating to flavonoids, right? Like flavonoids in plants actually decrease that risk. There's a drug called flavopyridol, I think, flavopyrinol or flavopyridol with a D or an N. It's an FDA approved drug that basically protects you against heart disease, especially with people with that specific risk, that CDKN2B gene. And what's funny is that flavopyrinol, it's just basically a flavonoid mimetic. It just imitates flavonoids. So you can just get the darn flavonoids. You don't have to go and get a prescription and get a drug. You can just eat plants with a lot of these colors and flavonoids and coffee and whatever, like grapeseed and proanthocyanins. So things like that, right? Like really help mitigate the plaque risk, the artery plaque, if people are concerned about it. You know what I mean? Like, so I'm looking for all these kind of things that are unique. And I recommended for that guy, don't do the carnivore diet because your body really does need these flavonoids compared to the average person.
Interesting. And I appreciate the kind words about self-decode. I didn't even know that you used it before you just mentioned it. So
right.
I appreciate that.
Yeah.
Yeah. So that's interesting about the guy who was doing a carnivore diet, because I'm not sure. There's another gene that I speak about. It's the cannabinoid 1 receptor.
Okay. Yeah.
Yeah. When I found that problems in the cannabinoid 1 receptor, and there's a specific SNP there, it actually makes people much more likely to do well with a carnivore diet.
Oh, so interesting.
Yeah.
Cool.
So for example, there's a particular SNP that is quite impactful. So this SNP is only found in like 3% of the population. And when I was doing consults, I mean, a lot of people, they didn't know what their issues were from and whatnot. And what I found was that when I really had a strong suspicion that these issues were from food, not other related, it could, toxic exposure, a number of other things, I found that they had this specific gene.
Yeah. And kind of like the other side of the coin. Yeah.
What was really interesting is, the person who's most sensitive to all these things is Michaela Peterson, right? She had rheumatoid arthritis when she's 7 years old, So if you're talking about these kinds of sensitivities, the person who has the strongest sensitivity and who's doing best in the most pure kind of carnivore diet is Michaela Peterson. And so when I did a podcast with her, I said, I'm curious. Like, look, I don't know if it's for sure going to be the case because it's only 3% of the population, but so it's a 1 out of 33 chance just by
She sent you her DNA.
She sent me her DNA. I
awesome.
uploaded it. It's on the podcast. You can check it out.
Wow.
I uploaded it, and on the podcast, I see she has the same variation as me. So it's only 3% of the population, and the risks associated with that variation, a lot of them overlap with the issues that people find have been improved by a carnivore diet, right? Like anxiety, things like that.
Yeah. Super interesting. No, I love that. I mean, that's one of the things I like to do too is, basically stay on the cutting edge of science and find these things, It's funny because I almost listened to that. That one's on my queue, on my podcast queue to listen to with Michaela and you. But I didn't know that. That's really good, man. Good job.
I think what we have in common, one thing is that we realize genetics is the future in terms of, realizing genetics, epigenetics, lab tests, of course, as well. But, genetics is a very strong component in how you respond to anything, really, right?
Right.
So if you have one variation of gene or another, I mean, it can have a massive impact on on all these things. But yeah, what were you going to say?
I was going to say people, I totally agree. And people oftentimes try and denigrate DNA, like, oh, it's just genetics, and now we know about epigenetics and we realize DNA is not important. It's like, no, it's super important. It's just epigenetics is also important, because if you're making a flawed protein, right, if your DNA code is flawed and then you're making a flawed protein, you're definitely going to have an effect, a bad effect. So genetics is super important, like, but there's kind of this mindset right now in recent months that genetics isn't that important and people are kind of downplaying it. But that's not really the right answer either. So I'm glad you said that.
Well, when people, I'm hearing this a lot as well. People will say, hey, it's the epigenetics that matters, right? The genetics isn't really so
Right.
important.
Exactly.
My response to them is, you know what influences epigenetics?
Yeah.
Your genetics, right?
Right.
What
Right.
your genetics is actually coding for proteins that change your epigenetics, right? There's
Yep.
for example, if you have the MTHFR gene, which I'm using because most people know, right?
Mhm.
That means you're
Mhm.
not going to get as much folate. You're not going to get as much active folate, right? That your body
Right.
needs for methylation. What do you think
Yep.
that's doing to your epigenetics, right? It's changing your
Oh, big
epigenetics.
time. Right. Big time.
So yeah, the environment is really interacting with your genetics to change the epigenetics. And so whenever I hear like, hey, what about, epigenetics? It's like your genetics is changing your epigenetics.
Right. 100%. I mean, they have to go hand in hand. You can't just consider one and without the other one. That's where a lot of people are getting it wrong by just thinking epigenetics is the only thing that matters. And trust me, like I'm the epigenetics guy. I do epigenetic research at the Mayo Clinic on stem cells, and I published my book, which is centered around epigenetics and estrogen impacting epigenetics. But DNA is super, super important.
Yeah, one last topic that I want to get to, and this is just because it's an area where you're researching stem cells.
Mm-hmm.
I'd like to get your opinion on the field as a whole, right? I'm sure
Yeah.
you know of these clinics in these random countries like Peru or whatever,
Oh yeah.
where they have clinics and they promise to cure a bunch of different diseases. What do you think at this stage of, let's say, stem cell injections,
Mm-hmm.
right? You think that it can help conditions?
No, I think for sure. The problem is, right? It's just like the DNA. There's a lot of interpersonal variation, and a lot of people have messed up epigenetics on their stem cells. So people do these autologous stem cell injections where they take fat cells, and at the Mayo Clinic we take stem cells from patients' fat, from human fat. The problem is it's so variable, right? Because people are eating crappy diets and they're messing up their fat stem cells. And so you can get a totally different result from two different people. If you've got somebody who's been healthy, eating paleo type diet or eating some kind of clean diet and keto, whatever, something healthy, and then, you take out their stem cells, those stem cells are like totally different than the person who's eating at McDonald's every day. And therefore, if you re-inject those stem cells into that person, you grow up a ton of them and you re-inject them, they're going to respond differently. But usually the people that are eating healthy aren't the ones with the chronic diseases to begin with. So that's kind of a problem. But I mean, the other problem is that my favorite are the umbilical cord stem cells in terms of homing in on sites of inflammation and fixing that. The problem is there's a whole culture against stem cells within the orthopedic realm. So like on my name badge and stuff, it says orthopedic surgery. Like that's my department at the Mayo Clinic. The problem is behind the scenes, these guys are making so much money doing knee replacements and hip replacements and things like that. They're very disparaging about stem cells. So anything negative that they can say about stem cells, they will say about stem cells because the money is not there. The money is in the surgery. It's a lot better for them financially to just do a whole knee replacement rather than just injecting stem cells. So there's a culture of negativity around it, and they couch it. Usually it's couched in this phraseology like, yeah, they sometimes work and they sometimes don't, and it's complicated, like that kind of thing. But the no bullshit, cut through all that true outlook, in my mind at least, is that they work almost too good that they're cutting into the bottom line. But that's an opinion, right? I mean, but
right. They haven't done like enough clinical trials on it.
Well, you can't because every stem cell is different, like different people. Where are you getting your stem cells? So it's difficult to do it. So the reason they're going over to exosomes is because you can patent those buggers, right? So an exosome is just like something secreted by a stem cell. And then you've got just one specific mRNA in there or one specific this or that. And so they patent it. The problem is if you're injecting exosomes, it's not as precise. It might not be precisely what you need in your situation. Right. So if you got a sore joint or something or chronic joint pain and you inject exosomes, that may or may not work. But if you inject stem cells, the stem cells will home in on the site of inflammation and secrete the appropriate exosomes, because there's thousands of different, maybe millions of different, types of exosomes. Like we're just barely scratching the surface in the research for exosomes. And the stem cells themselves will understand the context. If they're healthy stem cells, they'll understand what needs to be secreted, which exosomes need to be put out there, and they'll pump those out. And that's a lot better of it. But nobody's making money on that in terms of patents, because you can't patent stem cells. So that's why there's such a negative bias against stem cells in this country, because there's no money to be made there.
And since there's no money to be made, there's not a lot of studies, and then you're not going to have regulatory approval.
Exactly. And the studies that are done, it's hit or miss, because the stem cells are usually they're McDonald's stem cells.
Right. You can't just order some kind of substance from a different country. You got to go to a clinic that can do it, and you can regulate clinics well. So
exactly,
they can't operate in the US.
Yeah, it's a tricky situation. And now they've basically made it so you can't grow up numbers of stem cells. So what you can do is you can take out your fats, you can take out stem cells from your fat and then re-inject them. But it's like, well, I already had those stem cells. I want to grow up 1 billion of them and then re-inject them. You know what I mean? Mm-hmm. But now you're not allowed to grow up more. So they call it minimal manipulation. Only minimal manipulation is allowed. And that means you can't even grow up more stem cells. So it kind of defeats the purpose, right? To take stem cells out and just re-inject those same ones right back in. The whole idea, what I was researching at the Mayo Clinic, what I've been looking at is infrared light. So I use the Juve light. And again, I make no money from Juve. I just like their product. And I shine it on the stem cells, and it increases all kinds of interesting epigenetic changes, basically enhancing stem cells, right?
Right.
So I'm trying to do performance enhancement for these stem cells and then put them back into people. But the problem is now that's illegal. You know what I mean? So now I've shifted a little bit of my focus, because it's like, well, what's the point of doing research? Even though the research is cool, if you can't actually use it in the clinics, right? It's pretty hard to keep that going in the research lab. So I kind of shifted over to lungs. And I've been doing infrared studies with people with asthma, and studying the gene expression changes there. But I mean, it's too bad. It's frustrating to me as a stem cell scientist, because I think there's huge potential there.
Interesting. Okay. Yeah. I mean, this has been a very interesting talk. We went through a lot of topics. I have learned interesting things here. So can you tell people where they can find you?
Yeah, just ajconsultingcompany.com. I'm obviously on Twitter and Instagram, the usual stuff, just under my name, Antony Jay, Antony GJ, I guess. Mm-hmm.
Okay. And you have any services that you sell?
No, just the DNA consulting, which is like...
and then you have your book as well.
Of course. Yep.
That's the Estrogeneration.
Yep. It's on Amazon, Barnes & Nobles, everywhere. Mm-hmm.
Got it. Okay. That's great. So it was great talking to you, and